Welcome to this Education and Philosophy podcast, part of a series introducing key ideas in education and philosophy. The ideas covered in this series are discussed in relation to their potential use to present-day thought and practice. This series draws from the book Education and Philosophy, published by Sage, to which there is a link below. This podcast is the first in a two-part series that will discuss the concept of critique. I will enter into a fairly detailed discussion of the term. Critique is difficult to define and deserves careful attention for reasons that I will outline in what follows. These ideas, discussed in this two-part series, are dealt with in more detail in Chapter 10 of Education and Philosophy. Students of the arts, humanities and social sciences will be familiar with the feedback that to score higher on assessments they need to be more critical. The importance of critique is insisted on in higher education. Scarcely any university course will fail to assert that it values the development of critical thinking as a key aim. Students are expected to demonstrate other skills, of course, but will be reminded over and again that their worth as a student will, apparently, be judged to a significant extent on their ability to critically analyse, reflect upon, engage with, and review the texts, data, arguments, ideas, views and findings they encounter in their studies. Critique, criticism, criticality, critical thinking, critical awareness are everywhere in the academy, like banners staking out the territory, signalling the distinct and unique nature of the field. That territory is, of course, the domain of Western thought. The protocols of critique, its proponents suggest, are what distinguish Western thought from the kinds of knowledge and modes of inquiry that have been developed in other cultures, in other civilizations. Critique, it might be said, is what polices Western thought, what keeps it honest and faithful to its authentic purposes. This account of the importance of critique trails a certain racism, as if Western scholarship discovered a master code that eluded other traditions, a code whose discovery renders the achievements of non-Western thought questionable, if not obsolete. The assumption can too easily be made that outside the West it never occurred to anyone to question why they were required to think or act in certain ways, let alone express views that conflicted with established understandings. Critique has certainly been practiced in cultures beyond Europe, but it is indisputably the case that nowhere else has so much been made of it. It is true that students from other cultures are sometimes concerned as to what criticality might be, what they will have to do in order to fulfill its demands. In fact, this is an anxiety shared by many students from indigenous Western backgrounds who are similarly taken aback by the insistence at every turn in the academy that they be critical. Yet what is meant by critical thinking varies widely. If one considers the research output of university humanities or social science departments, critical practice can denote the ability to adjudicate between conflicting arguments, to assess the quality of evidence presented, or to problematize ideas and issues on the basis of some normative framework. A lot of the signposts for criticality or critical work in this context are stylistic and structural. Academic papers appear to be critical because they obey a set of conventions that dictate what a critical argument looks and sounds like. Criticality can be applied to the matter of giving a truthful account of reality as it is. For example, it can be applied to an analysis of the successes and failures of different methods for encouraging mathematical learning in the early years of schooling. Or, criticality can be applied to an argument for how things should be. And that should be might simply amount to a recommendation as to how some educational goal might best be achieved on the basis of available evidence, or it might involve the questioning of an educational policy on grounds of principle. For example, committing one cohort of school pupils to a heavily vocational curriculum and another to a broader, more academic programme invites the accusation that foundational educational values are being transgressed. In this case, the educational values of equality of opportunity for all pupils and the right to an education that will develop their full human potential. In other words, critique can operate at the level of empirical inquiry or at the level of socio-moral theory. In principle, critique can range between obedience and revolt. Critique can work comfortably within its institutional setting, accepting the boundaries, the established directions and methods of the field within which it operates, but working always towards the refinement of its procedures for producing knowledge. Or it can seek the transformation of the academic field in which it is located, the radical redirection of its aims, purposes, and self-understanding. Critique can remain subservient to what might be seen as the dominant values of society, or it can commit itself, however implausible such a project might seem, to the subversion of existing relations of power and their replacement by some other organization of those relations. In the university, critique is generally at the obedient end of the spectrum. Here, criticality typically obeys strict boundaries. For the student, critical abilities are to be shaped within the constraints of the academic essay or dissertation. You are welcome to be critical, in other words, so long as you conform to academic protocols. But university academics are subject to similar disciplinary pressures. Academic critique has its conventional forms, such as the professional journal article or conference presentation, which are carefully regulated. Intellectual critique may abound and proliferate within these contexts, and yet, despite its elevated status as the objective which all good, that is to say all enlightened, educational institutions must encourage, criticality is subject to definite restrictions. Academics are, it can be argued, largely compliant in their everyday navigation of the system they serve. They are better at surviving within the system than subverting it or refusing the power plays it imposes. Of course, most academics would vigorously reject the suggestion that they lack criticality or the courage to speak truthfully to power. Academic freedom is held up by those working in the university as the freedom that defines the institution, a freedom to pursue ideas wherever they take us. But though modern educational institutions may encourage their members to think freely, they are relatively intolerant of those who follow through on their ideas by putting them into action. The academy, or indeed the school, is uncomfortable with those who not only have ideas and opinions that differ from the dominant institutional view, but who insert them into practice, thereby turning those ideas back on the institution and its policies through direct action or through public critique of institutional decisions. The teacher who writes to a local newspaper expressing disagreement with her school's decision to become an academy, or the academic who publicly criticizes the educational validity of a university course, is likely to be putting his or her career in a degree of jeopardy. So, to summarize, it would seem as though critique is encouraged and supported in today's university or school within definite limits. In the university, where the ideal of academic freedom still has some purchase, the critic may say pretty much anything he or she likes, so long as it is well justified, is not libelous, offensive, or toxic, and so long as it makes sense within an established disciplinary tradition. But the critic should maintain a division of some kind between theory and practice. Critics become suspect and place themselves in jeopardy when they attempt to follow through with their ideas in practice, if those ideas do indeed entail some kind of confrontation with dominant political and social norms. As the accompanying podcast, Critique Part 2, will argue, this kind of systemic hypocrisy is built into the concept of critique itself.